Will you pray with me? Lord, now may the words of my mouth and may the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. We had hoped. Those words feel very familiar. We are living inside the reality of those words right now. We are walking a road that is littered with the broken plans we have made. Ask anyone in your life what they had hoped would be happening in their lives right now, and you will almost certainly hear a sad story. You have your own sad stories too. The two friends walking home to Emmaus from Jerusalem on the first Easter morning were talking about their own shared story of sorrow and suffering. They had been in Jerusalem, perhaps for Passover, when Jesus was handed over, condemned to death, and crucified. Now they are walking home, grieving and confused. The reality they had planned has been torn apart. We had hoped he was the one. Is there anything sadder than hope in the past tense? Well, I can think of one thing: the inability to find hope in the present. It's one thing to mourn the loss of things we had hoped for. But now many of us find ourselves in the strange position of not knowing what to hope for at this point, looking forward. How do you make plans? How do you make decisions? How do you let yourself begin to hope for something when the future seems like nothing but a cloud? At this point, most of us know there's no going back to the way things were. But what does it mean to go forward? Surely the two friends walking towards Emmaus felt something similar. They had hoped that Jesus was the Messiah who would change the world. They had hoped he would usher in the new kingdom he had promised. He was to be the fulfillment of it. Instead, he had been betrayed, arrested, tortured, publicly executed, and mocked while he died. And their hope died with him. Now, his body is missing, and some grief-stricken women have been going around claiming that some angels told them he is alive. The women, in their grief, are adding to the trauma with their fake news. The two friends can't undo the past, and the present looks pretty horrifying to them too. And what does their future look like? What does the future look like for the followers of a failed leader? As the two friends are walking and talking, a stranger walks up and joins them. And given how easy it is for people in pain to shut themselves off to newness, new people, new ideas, new experiences, isn't it beautiful that they are open to conversation with this man? And isn't it something that the first thing Jesus does after being raised from the grave is to go for a walk? We heard it in the story of the women at the tomb 2 weeks ago on Easter morning. They were running down the path from the tomb, and Jesus walked up to them and says, "Good morning." Now it is evening of that same day, and here he is again on a path, out for a walk. This is how Jesus appears to his friends after the resurrection. not in a grand, triumphant fashion, but quietly slipping up alongside them, going on the road with them. Jesus is on the move. As they walk, he asks them what they're talking about, and they ask him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who doesn't know what's happened here?" Which is funny and ironic, because the truth is, he's the only one who does know what has really happened. The friends tell this whole sad story, and they look right at Jesus, but they still don't see him. Because that's what happens sometimes when your hope is dead and your heart is broken. You can look right at the truth and not even recognize it. Jesus listens to their pain and their disappointment. And now it's his turn to do the talking. And he retells the story, the same story they have just finished telling. He tells, but with a bigger frame. He goes back to the real beginning of the story, back to Moses and the prophets. And he interprets the stories of Scripture to them. The story he tells them is bigger than they had understood. And it's better. And it's more beautiful. It doesn't end with death, but it contains it. It doesn't end with sadness, but it holds it, has space for it. Jesus does all of this as he walks alongside them. He doesn't rush the point. He doesn't rush them to get perspective on the loss they feel. He just walks with them and tells them a story big enough to hold all their pain, all their disappointment, all their broken hopes. When they finally finish the 7-mile trek to Emmaus, Jesus keeps walking as if to keep going. He's not one to force himself on people. But the two travelers urge him to stay, and he does. They sit at a table together, and Jesus takes bread and blesses it and breaks it and gives it to them. And all of a sudden, they see. They recognize him. And then he's gone. The whole time, the whole journey, when they thought he was absent, he was actually right there with them, present. And the moment at the table when they realize he's present, he becomes absent. We know a lot these days about presence and absence. We might be tempted to say we actually know more about absence, but that isn't quite true, is it? Our absence from people we love has actually drawn their presence into a new kind of sharpness, hasn't it? Our absence from the spaces and the routines that ordinarily define our lives has pushed us into the sometimes uncomfortable and somewhat constant presence of the people we live with, including ourselves. Pushes us to be present to ourselves and some of our basic needs, maybe more than ever, at least more than is comfortable. Our absence from our church building has opened the door for the presence of people who need shelter. And the absence of a known future forces us to reckon with the presence of the present moment in new ways. It goes further than all of these trade-offs, though. Our absence from each other and from other people we love has been a physical absence. But a physical absence isn't a total absence. We've heard this distinction made when people have challenged the language of social distancing. There have been people who have said we should be using the phrase physical distancing instead, acknowledging that our physical separation from each other doesn't have to be a relational separation. We aren't cut off from community. We are becoming present to each other in old ways like letters and phone calls, and in new ones like this. We use the word virtual for this kind of gathering, which implies that it is almost real, but not quite. But is that true? Is it true that this isn't real? What if it isn't a binary? What if both absence and presence can be true at the same time? What if it can be true that we miss the physical, in-person presence of other people, and we have also become more present to each other than we've been before? Or that we could become more present to each other than we had ever imagined. There's an intimacy here that has new dimensions. There's a coming together here. There's a reliance on each other here. There's a vulnerability that we are leaning into together. We are leaning towards each other. And it is more than virtual. It is real. For people who claim a faith that has incarnation at its core, it's tough to reckon with a physical separation. The incarnation is our proclamation that in Jesus, God took on human flesh and lived among us, fully human and fully divine, physical, not just spirit, embodied, enfleshed. As people who claim the incarnation of God in human flesh, it matters that we aren't able to be physically present. And yet, from the very beginning, the followers of Jesus had to grapple with absence. The whole thing started with an empty tomb and a missing body. And even after the risen Christ appears to them, he doesn't stay physically present with them forever. He doesn't stay physically present with them for very long at all. We see it in the story of Emmaus, how he disappears the moment they realize he's present. And yet this time, his disappearance isn't a cause for grief, but of joy. They run the 7 miles back to Jerusalem at night to tell the others what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. It's as if they know there's a promise in it. There's a promise that he's still available, that he's still present, albeit not physically, when people share, stories, when they listen to each other, when they accompany each other, when they share a table. This tension between presence and absence has always been a part of the fabric of our faith. Digital theologian Catherine Schmidt argues that the mystery of the incarnation draws us into the tension between presence and absence, and that this tension is actually a creative place. It's the place of Christian imagination, she says. But we're always trying to collapse the space by trying to resolve the contradictions, because it's hard to live in the tension between presence and absence, between the journey and the destination, between the human and the divine, between now and not yet. But it is in that tension, it is in that creative space that we actually encounter the holy God. And it's in that tension, that creative space, where we find each other most authentically as well. When we give ourselves to the awkward challenge of being present in the midst of absence, and of listening to pain without rushing to fix it, and of honoring another person's experience without imposing our own. It is in that tension, that creative space, that we will also find ourselves most authentically. In the willingness to be present to who we really are, to what we really want, to what we really fear, to what we grieve and regret, and what we long for. It's in that creative space where we hear the truth of, I had hoped, and where we can also hear and even tell and even live a bigger story without rushing it or pushing it or imposing it. It's the space where we discover we are not alone. We are never alone. We never were. We are on a difficult road right now, walking for an unknown time towards an uncertain future. There are so many broken hopes behind us and all around us. And it's hard for us to know what to hope for even now. But the risen Christ walks unseen alongside us. We would have preferred a definitive appearance, a physical presence. But in his physical absence, and in this strange time of physical absence from each other, we have an invitation to become present to each other and to ourselves and to God in new ways. Our willingness to hear each other's hurts, to hold non-judgmental space for each other's experiences, to honor our new realities, to extend radical hospitality and unconditional love to the people in our lives, to the people we live with, including ourselves, to accompany each other, even virtually, on this road. This is where hope is born again, because it is where Christ will keep showing up, which is to say, it is where our new future begins.